what I'll do is I'll put onto the Facebook, so that will be live. Okay.
I've got no sound, Ronnie.
No, that's okay. You just a moment. That's a bit of a setup. Get it to go onto Facebook. Facebook family now in. Should have really. Just a moment, and we'll.
Got a message, Ronnie, saying it's being broadcast live.
Yeah, that says go live in a little while, so I'll just put this is July book draw. Now we're now going live.
Okie doke.
Right, can everyone hear me? I can't see it because I've got. Yeah. Just go back to. Right, so we're now we're now live on Facebook. This month's book draw is for Alistair's Forgotten Highlander. Keith and I met Alistair 2006 at the Great Yarmouth Feeple Day gathering. He came all the way from Scotland to be with us, which was brilliant. Such a character. He was a brilliant character to talk to, and he came in his Scottish trews. Brilliant. He was absolutely brilliant. I'll hand you over to Barbara to say a bit on the book. Okay, Barbara? Over to you.
Okay. Right, thank you. So, The Forgotten Highlander. Well, I'd like to talk a bit about Alistair as the man. And, of course, he was born. He was born in 1919 in a small fishing village, which is called Newton Hill, which is a parish of Buckney in Scotland. But after 4 years, they moved out to Aberdeen. And he had his usual time at school, being a very enthusiastic little sports player, and he loved to be a member of the Scouts as well. So he did really well at school. But when he was 15, his family unfortunately fell into financial difficulties. I think it was around that time when there was a lot of problems with the boom and bust thing that we've seen here, but it was even worse for them then. So he was told really that he'd got to leave school. So he volunteered and said, yes, okay, because of his father's financial problems. And he went to work as an office boy at a plumber's merchant's, and he worked his way up, eventually being promoted to the showrooms and becoming a trainee warehouseman. And he was a keen member of the Scouts, and he played football, he did gymnastics, and, you know, was an all-round good kid, really. But on Sunday, the 3rd of September, 1939, a very important day, he was called up to the MD's office and told to go home. And he said, well, why? And they said, well, didn't you know? War has broken out. So off he went home. And pretty soon after that, his life changed because he was conscripted into the Gordon Highlanders Regiment on the 23rd of September. And he left his life of comparative comfort and moved to the basic hard training that is involved when you join the army. Then training done, he moved on to be put onto standby to go out to the Far East. And they were issued with tropical kit. I think the British Army tropical kit would have probably done them in the Arctic as well, but that was our way then. He had to travel in full Highland dress, so it was interesting to say that when you met him, Ronnie and Keith, he was wearing his trews. But when they travelled out to the Far East, they travelled in full Highland dress. So they had to travel down to Dover in their full kit, sitting on their kit bags in third class, something which was, I think, pretty uncomfortable. And they travelled off down through France to Marseille, where he embarked on the ship called the Andes, which took them all the way to Singapore, stopping at Port Said, through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, onto Aden, Calcutta, down the coast of the Malay Peninsula, dodging German submarines all the way. And then 3 weeks later, they landed in Singapore. They assembled on the promenade deck in full Highland dress in 80-degree temperatures, which as Scotsmen, they were not used to, I shouldn't think. And they soon realised how important it was to keep their heads and necks covered, and probably their knees too. He moved from there with them to Selarang, which was the Gordon Highlanders' barracks. And he's put a little interesting note in something I read, where they were warned about where they went out in Singapore, as sexually transmitted diseases were rife.
Yep.
And if they came back showing signs of that, they were going to be put on charge and severely dealt with. So once they were all about having had that lecture and being frightened, I'm sure, they were issued with their jungle kits and a substantial rifle, which had been made in 1907. So as you can imagine, it was already pretty well out of date, and they were all pretty decrepit. So they lined up for an inspection, and the whole lot of them failed. 6 weeks of relentless training followed that in the intense heat. They also celebrated Christmas with a traditional fare, which they ate in 90 degrees, and he says that it didn't feel right at all. Being the Alistair that he was, he managed to find time for playing sport and socialising. Socialising, because of the warning, I think he managed to find that it was nice just to go dancing, and dance halls were air conditioned, so that had an attraction in those tropical heats. So they were then ordered up country to Port Dickson for jungle manoeuvres, and this is where Alistair had quite a tough time, because he fell into a bush of ants, red ants, and got badly bitten, which absolutely terrified him. Shortly after that, he was transferred to Fort Canning, which was a lot more comfortable. It was the headquarters of the General Staff and also of the Royal Corps of Signals. It was very busy, though, because he comments that he was doing a lot of typing and office work, and the adjutant and the sergeant major were often missing, and I think he discovered that they were both alcoholics and weren't fit for duty. He'd got a pal called Tommy, and they used to go out dancing quite a lot. And he actually won a competition and was presented with a small cup and a mantle clock, which he, treasured quite a lot. And he also started to give lessons to Chinese people there, for which he got paid, and which were a good booster to his pay. But things were getting tense, and the mood of war was in the air. This was December 1941. And the code Matador was being used. Some of you might know about code Matador.
Yeah.
And then on December the 8th, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and war was declared on Japan. The strange thing that I discovered was that colonials living out in Singapore weren't very supportive of the troops, and they were actually quite obstructive. They refused them to use civilian phone lines, which meant that they couldn't get in touch with the different places that they were situated. And the rail officials insisted that civilians got right of way over the army staff. So it caused chaos. Often Red Cross and hospital trains were shunted into sidings, and it really wasn't good. Anyway, hostilities were hotting up, and the Gordon Highlanders were worried that there was going to be more issues, which we know happened. And Alistair was put in charge of 3 boy soldiers. Now, I found this really interesting because I hadn't heard of this. There were 2 brothers, aged 14 and 15, and another young lad of 16. The 2 brothers were actually the sons of a Gordon Highlander, so I presume that's why they were there. Alistair was put in charge of looking after them, and there were air raids, lots and lots of air raids. And unfortunately, we had no fighter planes to fight them off. And the poor boys were terrified, so he put them in the barracks. EPO, does that ring a bell? Fell by Christmas. And the Navy had the Prince of Wales and the Repulse sunk by kamikaze pilots. Both the Army and the civilians were retreating down into south into Singapore, and it was a really desperate time. Alistair had got his own hut at the side of the reservoir, and he was quite dismayed when that got bombed, and he lost most of his personal belongings, including his favourite record player and his records. Then the retreat happened. On the midnight of 8th of February, what remained of the Argyll and Sutherlanders and the Cordons escaped across the causeway to Singapore. He noted that some of the high-ranking officers used Red Cross ambulances to make their escape, and I think that didn't go down well. And then started the world's most worst military campaign in history, that modern times, was the battles that ensued up until the 15th. And he noted that fine men died, and Japan was able to bomb at will. Fort Canning became the prime target. And the ceasefire happened actually on the 14th of February, and the Japanese entered Singapore on the 16th. He was in the march that went 15 miles to Changi Garrison. They had no water on the way because of the shelling. But he was put in charge of the boys, who refused the opportunity to go into civilian clothing and not be captured with the soldiers. But they said no, they wanted to stay with them. So Alistair was given the job of looking after these boys and of educating them up to GCE standard. Work parties were going on for the rest of the troops, but Alistair was kept busy with the boys. No one knew what the boys' fate was going to be. An interesting comment was that concert parties were held. And this belies all the horror that you hear, because he commented in what I read that there was a violinist playing the one night, and he listened to Mendelssohn and Bruch, that's my favourite composer, in the moonlight, which must have been quite surreal when you've just been captured. Then the 1st of September came the declaration that all the troops had got to sign the promise not to escape. So that was the crush. And the men were dying in the sun in the day and the cold at night, and they sang Land of Hope and Glory to keep their spirits up. Eventually, as we know, they came to an agreement about the signing, and that passed. But by that time, while all of this was going on, the men were suffering from dysentery, malaria, prickly heat, etc. They had very little food to feed 30,000 men. So some was being stolen from the docks. And again, the officers were really not in favour, because they were stealing tins of fruit and corned beef for themselves and not sharing it. The good news was that the boys passed their exams. Alistair was able to keep in touch with the boys after the war, but Freddie lived with his time of being in prison literally in his head. He couldn't dissociate a lot of the time from reality. He still thought he was in captivity, and sadly he died at a very young age of alcoholism. Alistair, was sent then up the railway. I don't know how much detail you want to go into on this, or whether somebody wants to come in. But, they travelled up in the stifling heat after being promised, that they were going on holiday probably. They had one meal in 36 hours. Their next stop was Kuala Lumpur, where they had plain rice and a cup of awful tea. Then on to Penang, where they had rice and stew. The men were all starving. They were ill, and quite a lot of them died. And then they passed into Thailand and came out at Bampong. 6 days it had taken them to reach there, and he commented that it was a pathetic sight to see men unable to walk, semi-conscious, starving, had dengue fever, dysentery, malaria, and they had no medical supplies. They tried to make stretchers from bamboo poles with blankets and rice sacks between the poles, but none of them were fit enough actually to lift the men who were too ill to walk. He was involved in Hellfire Pass, and as we know, they said 13,000 men died, one man for every sleeper on the railway track. Having completed that, he was shipped back down to Singapore and loaded onto a boat called the Kachidoki Maru to go to Japan. And this is quite an important part of his life because sadly they were bombed by, torpedoed by an American submarine. And he ended up drifting for 5 days on a raft. Eventually they were picked up by a whaler and transferred to a labour camp in Japan, about 10 miles from Nagasaki. And I think it was the 9th of August 1945 when what eventually led to his freedom happened. He heard a plane and he knew that it wasn't a Japanese plane, it was an American plane. There was no opposition to the plane, which seemed strange. It wasn't being fired at. It droned overhead, and a few minutes later he was blown across the pathway by a big gust of wind and very hot air, and that was the bomb going off. And the bomb saved their lives, as there had been a directive to massacre all the prisoners on the 12th of August if the Americans dared land on Japanese territory. Alistair eventually returned to Aberdeen, and the family were wonderful, but he had been so affected by what had happened to him, he couldn't cope with it, and he'd go out first thing in the morning, walk miles and miles, and sometimes even didn't come back till the next morning. He couldn't eat, he couldn't stay indoors, he had mood swings, he felt demoralised. I think that really signified what a lot of our poor FIPOs felt when they came back. Anyway, there was Mary, his sweetheart, who stood by him, and they eventually married. But he couldn't sleep in the marital bed. He had awful nightmares and terrors, and one time he woke with his hands around her throat, which absolutely terrified him. But life settled down. He had his family, and things were better. But then she died, Mary did, in 1993, and he wrote a brief, sanitised memoir for his family of his experiences, which led on to this book that we're going to be giving away in the draw today, in which he, wrote about more. So whoever wins the book will find out in detail what happened. Alistair, after Mary had died, managed to look after himself until he reached the grand age of 96, and then he moved into a care home. And he finally passed away on the 7th of October 2016. The one thing about the book is that it received a great welcome, and Steven Spielberg, apparently, his film company bought the rights to the book. I don't think anything has ever come to it, but I think there was a series that was made, and some of it was featured in that. Looking back, Alistair received an Outstanding Bravery Award on the 22nd of June 2007. I wasn't sure why he got that. I'd like to think they should have all got that, all those that came back, but maybe there's something specific, Ronnie, that you can tell me about. There was also a time which I know, Ronnie, you've talked about, was that his daughter had moved to Canada, lived there, and in September 2008, Alistair went and visited his daughter, Joyce. She was living in Ontario, and they'd been invited to go down by Mary Michael, I think that's right,
That's it, yeah.
to San Francisco, where the submarine, the Pampanito, is in dry docks, and he went to visit it. And I think, Ronnie, you're going to be the best one to tell us what was actually said in there. So that was great. Anyway, that's hopefully I haven't bored you too much, explanation
That was great.
of his life. Okay, so I'll pass over to you to fill us in the gaps that I've missed.
That was great, Barbara. After 2007, 2006, when we actually met Alistair. I did get in touch with him quite a bit, and I put together his story, which is in the Far Eastern Heroes. And we said we'd follow up with part 2, but part 2 became his book. So we never did do part 2 on the Far Eastern Heroes because his book came out. But one great thing, Mary from America, she got in touch and she said she made an appointment for Alistair to go and see the submarine. And one of the crew members said, why is he coming over? Is he still angry with us? I thought it was brilliant. But Alistair was he was such a character. He was really a lovely chap. You couldn't get annoyed with him at all because he tried so hard. But the award was for everything he'd done in the war, of course. And although we've had this out before, Bernard, he did go around schools, and the award was to keep the candle burning type of thing. He went round to schools and he did talk to the school children about his war efforts. Okay, so that was really what it was about. And if you have a look at the Far Eastern Heroes, that does show him dancing. He was a great dancer. He loved his dancing. But anyway, we'll go on to the draw. Okay. Right, you should see the draw on screen. I have altered it slightly so it's more presentable to what we're doing. Okay, so the first one, Matt, would you like to make a note of the name? Have you got a pen?
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
if you'd like to make a note of the name, I'll send the address later. But here we go with the draw. Right, Melanie Woolham. Okay, that's the. Yeah, we've got 2 books. One is you've got, Matt. And
I have here, you've got one as well.
The other one I have. I had a spare one, so this one is going as well. So the second person will be. Yeah, it will be. Yeah.
Michael Clancy.
Yeah, Michael Clancy will be the second one. Okay.
Great.
Stop sharing now. Okay. And the draw is open to all the charity family members, Feeble Family Charity members. If you'd like to join, we find you welcome. We have these video meetings twice a month, and they're quite enjoyable. You're only seeing a piece of it, but we do have quite a discussion about research and things. And it is, if you don't like to attend the meetings, the video is put on the secure pages just for the charity members, so you can watch it later. Okay, so we'll end this now. Thanks a lot for watching. Later, I will put a video on which will be clearer than the one you've just watched.